You know what a violin is, you love the sound, but did you know that the violin is made up of nearly 70 individual pieces? In this video, I'm going to show and explain every part of the violin. We're going to start with the scroll. The scroll is a curved part at the top of the violin. It is the only part of the violin that's essentially non-necessary. It is purely decorative, and it's traditionally a spiral that is said to be made up with the golden rule, but it can also be a custom scroll. My violin has a custom scroll of Niccolo Paganini. It doesn't change the sound one bit, but basically it is more expensive to create a custom scroll and usually is a custom job. Next, we have the peg box. The peg box is where the pegs are held inside the entire neck. So there's 4 holes on each side, and you will notice that the holes have slightly different diameters. They are conical, so they start out wide and go narrower, and their job is to essentially use friction between the hole in the peg box, which is made of maple, and the fine tuner, which can be of ebony, can also be painted maple or rosewood or perhaps a different wood like boxwood. Violins use old school pegs that haven't been changed for over 500 years because it's simpler, it's traditional, and it's a lot lighter than creating machine heads, which would be full of metal and would be heavier. The way that the peg works is the pegs have a hole for the string to go into, and as you turn the peg, it's going to increase the tension of the string, making it sound higher. So the way you string a violin is you will put the peg inside the peg box, you will put the string, and then you will turn it. You'll notice that the peg has 2 shiny parts. That's exactly where the peg box is. So in other words, it goes in like this. Because it's a smaller violin, my peg is not going to fit from a full size, but essentially it goes in, and the friction will hold the peg in place. So if we're going to have a demonstration, the peg will go in. We will then put the string inside, we will turn it, and the tension between the peg and the peg box is what keeps the peg from slipping and holding the tune of the string. Next, we have the nut. The nut is a really important part of the violin because the little ridges here is what dictates the spacing between the strings as well as the height of the strings. So if we take a look at this cutout violin, this is the nut right here, and you'll notice that it is above the fingerboard. So the nut dictates not only the spacing between the strings left to right, it also dictates how high each string is. One really interesting part about the nut is that professionals actually get custom nuts fitted to their violins. They might like the strings a little bit narrower or a little bit wider depending on their finger and their preference. And also there's a fine balance between the curvature of the fingerboard, which we'll get to later, the height of the nut, the height of the bridge, and a lot of professionals will actually get these 3 elements finely tuned for their preference of their playing as well as their instrument. They might want the string to be a little bit higher at the nut, but a little bit lower at the bridge, and they might want a particular scoop custom for a particular string. So this is a lot of experimentation, and when you get a student-sized violin, it will just have your standard dimensions, but professionals will often change the nut to be custom height and custom width of the strings, not necessarily for traditional specifications. Next, we have the neck of the violin. Now, the neck technically is this part where you would hold the violin and you would support the violin, and then you would actually support it with your knuckle, your thumb, and your fingers, and then you would move around to shift. You'll notice that the neck is fully curved. Now, the reason for everything to be curved, there's only a few straight lines in a violin, fingerboard being one of the few exceptions, is because as you play the violin, you need to come around, change the angle of your hand. You also need to come around and go into high positions. So the fact that the neck is pretty much all curved is to facilitate ease of moving when you play the violin. Now, the neck starts out as just a block of wood of which the neck gets carved. Then you have your peg box, you have your scroll, but the neck, as we'll see here, is essentially this solid piece of wood made of maple. And then the scroll will be carved out, the exact dimensions, But the neck is really important as it supports the violins in the peg box, and this is very, very structurally important alongside the fingerboard, that the neck is basically really supporting all the tension of all the 4 strings, and then it will also be part of the transfer vibrations to the body of the violin. Next, we have the fingerboard. The fingerboard is a really important part of the violin, and just like the name implies, it's where your fingers go. Now, the way that the violin works is that the string's length determines how fast the string vibrates, creating a particular pitch, like a G or an A or an F or an E or an F sharp. And when you press your fingers on the fingerboard, on the string, essentially we're making the string shorter. Shorter strings vibrate faster, creating higher sounds. That's how with only 4 strings in the violin, you can create every single note. Basically, when you press your fingers, you're making the string shorter, making the string vibrate faster, creating a higher pitch. Now, the fingerboard looks like a pretty simple piece of wood, but as we'll take a look at the cutout, it actually is quite interesting. You'll notice that it's not perfectly straight. It starts out narrower and it goes wider as you go up higher. And not only that, it also have a very specific curve, or a scoop as called in the industry, to facilitate when you press the string and the string vibrates. That way it doesn't touch the fingerboard, creating a buzzing sound. If we take a look at the cutout, you'll notice that the fingerboard is thicker here, and then it is basically, there's a scoop here as well to facilitate of the particular shape of the violin's top, which is not flat, it is curved as well. So every fingerboard has a cutout here, right? It is thicker here to provide structural integrity and strength to the neck. And there's a scoop here. It's kind of hard to see, but there's scoop on every violin. On my violin, you'll notice that the fingerboard is made of ebony, which is a hardwood. And it's a really, really hard wood, right? It's much harder than maple. And the reason is, as you play the violin for hundreds of years, if this was a softwood or like a maple or a spruce or anything that is not as hard as possible, like ebony, it would basically just deform and have holes and dimples throughout. So the reason for the scoop of the fingerboard is as you press and the string vibrates, because now the string is from my finger to the bridge. If we didn't have a scoop down, that string would be buzzing on the fingerboard. Next, we have the top of the violin. The top is fascinating because it is responsible for 90% of the violin's tone production. The top of the violin essentially is really arguably the most important part of the instrument, because this is what vibrates from the strings and the bridge, and we'll get to sound post and bass bar, but the violin's top is really where the sound and the vibrations are created. This is really the most important part of the violin. So the top of violin, this is a full-size violin and this is a 3/4 size violin. Has quite a lot of stuff. Now, the tops are always made of 2 pieces. So if you look closely, there is a piece of line here and piece of line here as well. Now, the tops are made from 1 piece of spruce, and the grain of the spruce goes longitudinally. So that makes sure that the vibrations of the strings are transferred through the entire top of the instrument. Every violin's top will have what's known as F-holes. This is where the sound escapes, and you'll notice that the F-holes have these little ridges. Now, they're not random or purely decorative. The ridges of the F-holes tell the violin maker or tell where the bridge is supposed to be. You'll notice that they are right here where the feet of this very old top are, and the little ridges on the F-holes is what dictates where the bridge goes. The top also has purfling, which we'll get to a little bit later, but it has purfling, it has F-holes. It is always made of 2 pieces of spruce, and it also has a bass bar and then a place for the sound post, which you'll see here. There's a little dimple that we're going to get to later. This particular instrument needs to be restored. You'll notice that it has a lot of cracks that have been filled, and makers often put these little patches. These have not been done very well. This needs to be redone completely, but if there's ever a crack, it is generally glued and patched with little pieces of wood. And you'll notice that the inside of the top does not have any varnish. So the top or the outside of the instrument for protection has basically like a base layer, and then it has varnish. And the inside of the instrument is completely unvarnished. That is to make sure that the top of the instrument vibrates as freely as possible. Next, we're going to move on to the back of the violin. The back of the violin is very interesting because it doesn't really produce that much sound, but it's structurally really important. Most violins, as in this student example, will have what's known as a two-piece back. Just like the front, it will be made of two pieces. So a slab of a piece of wood is cut, it's split in half, and then when it's glued together, it's perfectly matching. So majority of the instruments are two-piece design, front and back, such as this one. On my violin, and other violins as well, it is much more rare to see, but some violins will have a single piece back. You'll notice that there is no glue here, there's no connection. Now, it is much more challenging to find a suitable piece of maple that is wide enough to accommodate the entire back of the violin. Remember, the maker has to start with the blank that is much wider than the finished product, so they have some room to work with. But this particular instrument does not have a two-piece design, but a single-piece design. It is argued that maybe it's better or worse, honestly, since the back does not produce that much, is not responsible for that much of the tone production. I think it's purely more of just the resources and just does a particular maker, or if someone orders a custom violin, if they want something different or special. But the majority of the instruments are two-piece design. If we take a look at the back of the violin, of this cutout violin, you'll notice that there's quite a lot of changes in the thicknesses of the instrument. And this is one of the secret sauces of makers, is that each maker has a very specific thickness and gradation of the tops and the bottoms. And it's really more art than science, because you need to, when you make the instrument, you need to make sure that you think of the entire system, right? So the way the violin makes sound is the string vibrates, whether through plucking or bowing, and then those vibrations travel through the bridge, and then with the help of the samples and the bass bar, it gets transferred to the entire top. So you really need to think of the entire violin as a vibration system, and that's where the art, more than science, comes into play. Now, the gradation and the thicknesses of the Stradivarius, Amadis, and Guarnerius have been studied ad nauseum, but again, it really comes down to the particular wood and the skill of the maker. If you look carefully here, the thickness of the back where the top block is, you'll notice it's much thicker, and then it goes thinner, and then it thickens out again in the center. That is very common because you need the instrument's top and bottom thick where the structural parts of the instrument are, but then you want them as thin as possible so they vibrate as freely as possible, and then also thicker when you get down to the sound post for support. If you make the violin too thick, it will simply bend, and then essentially over time it will just crack and break. Next, we're going to move on to the sides or the ribs of the violin. So these are the ribs here, right here, and we're going to take a look at them in just a moment. Now, the way that the violin is made, and this is really, really interesting, is that the neck, the back, and the ribs are made from the same piece of maple. So that way the grain pattern of the entire instrument matches. So the back, the neck, and as well as the ribs are all made of the same instrument. So if you compare on my violin, the grain pattern of the neck, the grain pattern of the back, and the grain pattern of the sides, they're all perfectly matching. And that's because they're made from the same piece of maple, not only to look visually appealing, but also to make sure that the wood has the same properties so that the system of the violin vibrates in perfect unison and harmony. Now the top, the bottom, the neck of the violin are all carved into perfect shape, and the ribs is the only part of the violin that's actually bent into its shape. So what happens is when you get the maple slab of wood that you're going to make the violin from, you have little thin slices of wood that are cut out into its proper thickness and dimensions. And then what violin makers do is they grab the pieces of wood and they shape them with irons that have different basically shapes, and they use templates to make sure that the violin is perfectly shaped. But the ribs of the violin is the only part of the violin that is bent into its shape. To help the violin hold its shape with the top, ribs or sides, and the bottom, violin makers use what's known as linings or rib linings. They're basically just thin pieces of wood that are glued to the bottom, top, and the ribs, and they help to reinforce the structure and make sure that the top or the bottom of the ribs doesn't collapse or change its shape. They basically run alongside entire instrument. Right? They start at the top block to go around. They usually go over the corner blocks, and then they go all the way around to the bottom block of the instrument. The linings appear at the top and the bottom of the violin and go all the way around. Next, we're going to discuss the blocks. There's a top block, there's corner blocks on each end, and there's a bottom block. These are very structurally important. So these blocks is what helps to support the neck of the violin in place. So this is the block here from a cutout, and this is the top block that's actually in place. So this piece of wood here is really, really important. Now, this is a very, very, very beginner level instrument. You'll notice that this particular specimen has a bunch of just basically empty space here. That shouldn't be a properly fitted neck, should be right against the block. And violin makers will use chalk or other means to make sure that this is perfectly held together, so that to make sure that they stay in place and don't move. Now, what sometimes makers will talk about is they need to raise the neck or change the angle. The way that's done is basically with the when the neck goes into the wood block, they can change the angle, and that will raise or lower the neck. They're not going to physically lower or higher it this way. They're going to change the angle, and that's what's going to very importantly set the neck angle. So in the Baroque era, the necks of the violin were straight line, and the fingerboards were much thicker. And over time, the neck got pulled back, increasing the angle, and that helped to increase the tension of the strings, making the violin project and be louder. If we take a look at this violin, the top block and the bottom block, you'll notice that at the bottom of this top, there's a little cutout that is for the tailpiece saddle, and the top, there is a cutout for the neck. So the top block will be glued over here, and the bottom block will be glued over here. You'll notice that these parts of the instrument stop are flat. That is to make sure that they glue right against strongly the top block as well as here. And then the curve, the cutout of the curve starts after the linings and the blocks. The way that the top will go is it will slide in place. Your saddle will be here. That cutout will perfectly fit with the neck. And this is why you'll see only part of the top has varnish, right? So when the violin is closed, then it has a base layer applied to it, and then the varnish is applied only after. So you can tell if the violin or any instrument has been opened if you see discoloration here, because once you open it, it's not going to have that perfect varnish look. Next, we're going to discuss two of the most intriguing inner parts of the violin, and they are the sound post and the bass bar. So the way that the violin works is that the strings are under tension, and when you pluck or when you bow the string, that creates vibrations. The vibrations travel through the bridge, and this is really fascinating because the sound post is under the treble side of the bridge. The way that the violin works is that the string, when it vibrates with a pluck in your bow, shakes the bridge, and the vibrations travel through the sound post, which acts as a lever, and the sound post is under the treble side of the bridge or the high string, and the bass bar goes longitudinally from pretty much the top to the bottom of the top, and that helps to make sure that the entire top of the violin vibrates, and the bass bar is under the low or bass side of the bridge on the low string. The placement of the sound post is really intriguing. With a slight adjustment, whether up, down, forward, or back, or left or right, you can drastically change how the violin responds and sounds. So if you want a little bit more bass, you could adjust the sound post placement. If you want a little more treble, or you want the sound to be a little bit not quite as bright, or you want it to be dimmer, again, sound post is what most makers will adjust. Traditionally, it is slightly behind, the sound post is slightly behind the bridge towards the player's neck, and it is perfectly centered. Now, the bass bar also on the well set up violin should be perfectly in the middle of the violin's bridge. So the bridges come in different sizes, and the way that this is set up is the samples should be right in the center of the leg of the violin's bridge, and the bass bar should be also right in the center of the leg. Those proper proportions help to make sure that the violin vibrates well and produces loud and beautiful sound. On this violin with the bass bar, you'll notice that it runs from the bottom to the top, right? It goes longitudinally, and the grain of the spruce likewise goes alongside with the violin. The proper grain pattern of the top as well as the bass bar and its placement plays a crucial role. Now, when the bass bar is applied to the instrument, it is not just flatly glued. It actually acts like a spring. So the bass bar will have a little bit of space between each end, and when it's properly set up, what makers do is they glue the bass bar and you pull the top so that way it's under tension. So the bass bar basically holds the violin under tension, so when the strings vibrate, they vibrate much more than they would otherwise. The bridge is likewise a really important part of the violin. If it's made from improper wood, or perhaps it wasn't seasoned properly, it is too thick or too thin, it's going to basically wreak havoc on the sound. Just like the nut, the bridge is also adjustable. So what the professionals will do is they might want the strings to be slightly narrower or wider at the bridge, or they might want the strings to be a little bit higher or lower at the bridge level. So once you get past the basically intermediate, advanced, or a student grade instrument, you actually have a lot of room to customize your instrument with the bridge, the string placement, its height, as well as the nut. The tailpiece of the violin supports the strings. It also holds the fine tuners. So the tailpiece is secured on the opposite side of the neck and the peg box and the pegs, and the end button supports the tailpiece through a tailpiece gut, and the end button goes inside the bottom block. The tailpiece can be of many different colors. It could be aluminum, it could be made of wood, it could be different types of materials. The most popular ones would be ones that have the fine tuners built in, so it's nice and easy to use. And it pretty much doesn't really change the sound of the instrument all that much, except that visually it should match what your pegs are. So typically your tailpiece, your pegs, and very often the chin rest will be of the same color and type of wood, although not always. So my chin rest, is from boxwood, and the tailpiece and the pegs are rosewood. The end button supports the tailpiece through the tailpiece gut, and the end button is secured through a small hole in the bottom block. Structurally, it holds the entire tension of all four strings of the violin, and is a really small but important part of the instrument. The chin rest is there for comfort as well as to help secure the instrument. Did you know that in Baroque times, the violins were not held on the left side of the violin as we do now, but instead were held with the chin on the right side of the instrument. The bows were shorter and the entire setup was much more farther back and to the right. So if you see a really old violin with basically a light spot here, that is because the chins used to physically go there. And as we progressed and increased the technicality and how difficult things we can do, holding the violin on the left side as well as using the shoulder rest is something that all modern violinists do. The strings of the violin are really, really important. Now, professionals will be very particular with which strings they use and will even sometimes match from different brands. For example, on my violin, I have Eva Pirazzi complete set, but some instruments and some players prefer to have different sets. For example, they might use a Larson G, they might use Eva Pirazzi DNA, but for the E string, they might do something as cheap as Red Label or something like a stainless steel, very just simple string. On basses, cellos, as well as violas, it is much more common to see different sets mix and matching. On violins, most players prefer just a complete set. In old times, the violin strings were made from animal guts, as they were known as gut strings. And in the 19th century, we transitioned to metal coatings with all kinds of synthetic as well as natural internal materials. Now, purfling on a violin, and every violin has them, is these little thin strips of wood. There's a dark wood, a light wood, and a dark wood that's basically glued together. It is usually ebony and then maple or maybe some kind of different softwood and then an ebony again glued together. And the entire top on every corner will have purfling as well as the bottom. You'll notice that the entire bottom of the violin will always have purfling. Now, it is not just there for decoration. If you've ever seen an old piece of wood or a log, you'll notice that the ends of the logs often will split and will have cracks. So the purfling, aside from just creating strength at the edges, it's also to prevent the top and the bottom from splitting with use and time as the wood matures. If you could see in this video, you'll notice that the purfling is actually cut into the top and the bottom. So there's a little channel that gets cut into the edge of the instrument, and the purfling is get glued inside. That creates a really strong bond to make sure that the ends of the top and the bottom don't split with time. Varnish. Varnish is said to be the secret sauce of all violin makers. Now, whether that's true or not, every violin will have a very unique varnish. Even if you take two different instruments and apply the same exact varnish, they will look slightly different. That is because every wood will react and will look differently to the particular elements. Sometimes they can be red, yellow, brown, or everything in between. Now you'll notice that the maple always will have a changing grain pattern, which is really beautiful. Now on student level instruments, the varnish very often is actually polyurethane. You'll notice how shiny this is, that has not been polished at all. So that is basically because it's a very cheap material and it is very durable. This violin, for example, has very dark brown varnish, and my violin, in contrast, has much redder, much more yellower varnish. The color is completely up to the maker, and very often they have very special ingredients that they keep secret. Fine tuners. Professionals only use one or two for the top strings, but students will have usually all four. The way that fine tuners work is that when you turn a screw, it pushes the lever that holds the string backwards, increasing the tension of the string. And when you turn counterclockwise, it pulls the lever back, decreasing the pressure of the string, making the string sound lower. Right? I turned it clockwise, the string went up, and when I turn counterclockwise, the pitch of the string is going down. In this video, I showed and explained every part of the violin. I hope you found it entertaining and educational. Please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel to learn about violin with me.